And welcome back again to the world today. My guest is Dr. Marcus Papadopoulos, a magnificent analyst, author, and historian. Marcus, thanks for joining us. Can you tell me the latest between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, thank you, Mike, as always, for having me on your show. In regard to the front line in Ukraine, what we are witnessing at present, indeed, what we have been witnessing over the last few months, is the Russian army advancing across the entire front line. And I believe what is particularly interesting, particularly noteworthy, is that the Russian army is now in the Dnipropetrovsk region and is advancing steadily there. That is quite interesting because, as it currently stands, the Kremlin, officially speaking, has not made any claims to the Dnipropetrovsk oblast or region, as it is in English. So that corresponds with what I have said from the start of the Russian military campaign in Ukraine, that the Kremlin intends to capture a lot more than simply Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson. Indeed, I believe that the Russians intend to capture, for example, Sumy, Kharkov, Dnipropetrovsk, Nikolaev, and Odessa. If we talk about the latter, Odessa and Nikolaev, by the Russians capturing these two regions, which are on the Black Sea, this will mean that Russian supremacy, naval supremacy in the Black Sea, will be absolute. And of course, one of the main concerns of the Kremlin for many years now, indeed many decades now, since Ukraine became independent, is that NATO could establish a naval presence in Ukraine. And what we saw just a few years before 2022, when the Russians went into Ukraine, was NATO beginning to construct naval bases in Odessa and also in another port not that far from Odessa called Ochakov. They were doing that so that NATO vessels could dock there. So I believe that what we are seeing in Dnipropetrovsk corroborates my assertion that the Russians intend to capture a lot more than simply the Donbass, Zaporozhye, and Kherson.
Have there been false flags such as Russian aircraft violating Polish airspace? And I think there was a report that they had attacked a train. Can you just put these to rest for us?
There is a war between Russia and Ukraine. The Kremlin, of course, refers to it as a special military operation, but in reality, it is a full blown war between two countries. As a result of that, it is only inevitable, especially in the era of drones, that Russian drones could enter Polish airspace, which means NATO airspace. Now, there is no reason whatsoever why the Russian military would intentionally violate Polish airspace. Russia is not at war with Poland. Russia has no territorial designs on Poland. There is no love lost between Poland and Russia. And indeed, this goes back centuries. So if Russian drones have violated Polish airspace, then it will have been accidentally. The fact that Western mainstream media, such as British mainstream media, alleges that Russian drones entering Polish airspace demonstrates that Russia intends to threaten Eastern Europe, intends to enter Eastern Europe, is simply unsubstantiated poppycock. Where is the evidence that Russia intends to conquer Eastern Europe? Where? We must also bear in mind that one of the main objectives of Western mainstream media is to keep the narrative on Russia and on the war in Ukraine going. So any opportunity which falls at the feet of Western mainstream media will be exploited. So if a Russian drone accidentally enters Polish airspace, immediately Western mainstream media will say, there you are. Once again, we told you that Russia is an aggressive, expansionist country. Therefore, arming Ukraine to the teeth, sending Ukraine hundreds of millions of dollars is justified. So, in short, accidents occur in war. And let us not forget that this is the first war, the first major war involving drones. If America was at war with a country and was using tens of thousands of drones, then it is only inevitable that at some stage one of those drones will enter the airspace of another country which is bordering the country which America is at war with.
Tell me this: we know Zelensky is a puppet. Kolomoisky was the puppet master. Who do you think is Zelensky's puppet master now?
Ever since the coup in Ukraine in February of 2014, Ukraine has been a vassal state of the Western ruling elites, in particular Washington, London, and the European Union. In those years, stemming from 2014 up until 2022, the presence of the Western ruling elites became quite remarkable. There was much evidence that the Ukrainian military was being built up along NATO lines, that Western companies were taking over the Ukrainian economies, such as the industrial sector and the agricultural sector, that there were Western secret service stations littered all across Ukraine. And as I mentioned earlier, that NATO was starting to construct naval bases at Odessa and Ochakov to receive NATO vessels, such as NATO battleships. Politically speaking, many Western backed NGOs began to emerge. Many Western backed polling companies began to emerge. The latter is quite interesting because these polling companies were tasked with telling the rest of the world that Ukrainians and Russians are completely distinct to each other in racial and cultural terms. So these polling companies would put out alleged polling results showing that 70, 80% of the population of Ukraine wants nothing to do with Russia and Russians. Now, in terms of politics, the Western ruling elites moved very quickly, as inevitably they did. They were always going to ensure that Ukraine was managed by puppets, that Ukraine was managed by useful idiots. And that is one of the reasons, of course, that certain political parties in Ukraine were banned from running in elections, such as the Party of Regions, which dominated not just eastern Ukraine, but southern Ukraine, such as Odessa, Nikolaev, and Dnipropetrovsk and Kharkov. In regard to the key people in Ukraine, including Zelensky, yes, these people are all puppets. You ask who are their controllers. Their controllers will be the Americans, the British, and the Europeans, and they will have their people in Kiev or in Lvov. So if there is an expected heavy concerted Russian air campaign against Kiev, then Zelensky and his henchmen will be removed from Kiev and I would say taken to somewhere like Lvov, which is the heart of what is known as Ukrainian nationalism, or to be more accurate, Eastern Galician nationalism. So these are the people who control Zelensky and his henchmen.
Yeah, I'm just thinking and looking at chat too. Some of it mentioned, and to some of our preparation for this is that he's possibly Zelensky is possibly an asset. Hello, for Western intelligence. Any hard evidence that he is an asset for Western intel, or is it just people's not imaginations, but yeah, it could most likely be correct, but at this stage they haven't got that concrete evidence, or is there concrete evidence?
Following a coup by a foreign power or foreign powers, the aim is to take control of the country that the coup has taken place in. So no foreign power will orchestrate a coup in a country and then say to the people of that country, right, we got rid of the government there, we hand the country over to you. That is nonsense. That is, anyone who believes that is not just naive, but is clearly living in a parallel universe. That is not how it works. If we take Zelensky, he does exactly what Washington, London, and Brussels says. So if one day the aforementioned say one thing about Russia, that day or the next day, Zelensky will say exactly the same thing. Furthermore, it is clearly not in the interests of the population of Ukraine for this war to continue, especially bearing in mind that in places such as Dnipropetrovsk and Odessa and Nikolaev and indeed Kharkov, vast amounts of the population there identify with Russia. So it is clearly not in the interests of the people of Ukraine for the war to continue. But it is in the interests of the Western ruling elites for the war to continue, because they are attempting to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia by defeating the Russian military. And if the Russian military, hypothetically speaking, is defeated in Ukraine and pulls back into Russia proper, then immediately Ukraine would be admitted into NATO. So the fact that the Western ruling elites want the war to continue, the fact that Zelensky and his henchmen want the war to continue, provides ample evidence that the two are working together. In no way is it in the interests of the overwhelming majority of the Ukrainian population for this war to continue. I say the overwhelming majority because in what is known historically as Eastern Galicia, Lvov, Ternopil, Ivano-Frankivsk, and alongside that, Volyn and Rivne, there the population is very different to the rest of Ukraine. There you will find this notion of a Ukrainian national identity, of Ukrainian nationalism. There you will find hatred of Russia. The reason being is because in the aforementioned areas, there is Austrian blood, there is Polish blood, there is Lithuanian blood, there is Hungarian blood. The population there is very different in cultural terms to the rest of Ukraine. Indeed, the dominant religion in Eastern Galicia and Volyn and Rivne is not Orthodox Christianity. It is Roman Catholicism. That on its own should tell you that that part of Ukraine is very different to the rest of Ukraine. But yes, the people in those regions, even the average person, hates Russia to such an extent that they would be prepared to see the war continue. But they're prepared to see the war continue partly because the war is not in the westernmost part of Ukraine. It is in areas where the population overwhelmingly identify with Russia.
Is Ukraine seeking again to join the EU? If they are, what would the implications be?
Well, officially, nothing has changed ever since the coup in Ukraine. Ukraine has sought membership of the European Union and has sought membership of NATO. When I say Ukraine, I mean the Ukrainian colony, which is controlled by the Western ruling elites. So when we hear a politician in Ukraine say that we in Ukraine seek membership of the EU and NATO, that is because that person is a mouthpiece. That is because that person has been bought by the Western ruling elites. Can Ukraine join the European Union? Can Ukraine join NATO? Never. Maybe once the Russian military campaign has come to an end, and let's say that the Russian military has captured 70% of Ukraine and decides to call it a day because they don't want to go into eastern Galicia and have a population there incorporated into the Russian Federation, which is deeply hostile towards Russia, then yes, it is possible that that part of what used to be Ukraine would be admitted to both the European Union and NATO. But how can Ukraine join the European Union at present when there is a full-blown war occurring there? Because if Ukraine was to be admitted to the European Union, there would have to be security guarantees given by the European Union to Ukraine. And what would those security guarantees be? The European Union doesn't have an army. The European Union doesn't have an air force. It doesn't have a navy. And of course, we know that the European Union and NATO work hand in hand with each other. So all talk at present, as the war continues, of Ukraine joining the European Union amounts to nothing in practice.
They do have von der Leyen, and if you have a really big cannon, you could fire her towards Moscow. But otherwise, you are right about the military. That's a terrible thing for me to even say, so I apologise to Ursula if you're watching at the moment, which I believe you're not. Tell me, Zelensky himself, this guy, I mean, I once told someone he should crawl under a rock where his friends hang out with his other cockroaches. Zelensky's a bit like a cockroach. He just hasn't disappeared. Is that surprising to you?
I don't think there should be too much focus on Zelensky. Indeed, there shouldn't be too much focus on people like Starmer. These people are puppets. I am not saying that they are not complicit in crimes against humanity, because they are. My submission is this: they are puppets. If Zelensky was to be replaced tomorrow by the Western ruling elites, then his successor would do and say exactly as Zelensky has been saying ever since he was installed as president. So these people, these puppets, these useful idiots are complicit in crimes, but they are puppets. We have to target the puppet masters. Again, someone like Sadiq Khan is a mere puppet. If he's replaced tomorrow by the British establishment, his successor will implement the same agenda.
Yeah, I just sometimes we get lost for words when we see the how this is all panning out. Recent poll of Ukrainians indicated that people see corruption being, which is surprising, not becoming worse since the war began. I mean, can you ever pull out, never include corruption when having a discussion about Ukraine?
There is even more corruption in Ukraine today because there is even more money in Ukraine today, courtesy of Western governments having sent billions of dollars to the country. That said, ever since Ukraine became independent in December of 1991, which was against the wishes of the vast majority of the population, indeed over 70% of the population of Ukraine in March of 1991 voted to remain part of the USSR. But ever since Ukraine became independent, it has been one of the most corrupt of countries in the world, regardless of who was president, from Kravchuk to Kuchma to Yanukovych, who had, to an extent, Russian leanings, and then to the presidents, so-called presidents of Ukraine, following the coup in Ukraine, which, as I said, was orchestrated by the Western ruling elite, specifically Western intelligence services. So Ukraine is an extremely corrupt country. But where there is more money in a corrupt country, you will see that level of corruption rise even further.
Yeah, it's I just sometimes and Jennifer, who's my business partner and does a lot of the research, is just amazed at what is transpiring at the moment. You mentioned that when Russia have perhaps 70% of Ukraine, that they could quite possibly stop. How far away are we from getting to that 70%?
I was not surprised when the West imposed thousands upon thousands of sanctions on Russia. That to me was inevitable. Indeed, I had long said that should the Russian army enter Ukraine, then the sanctions which would be imposed on Russia would be unprecedented. What I did not foresee was the sheer amount of military equipment which NATO would pour into Ukraine, which would saturate the lands of Ukraine. I also strongly suspect that the Kremlin did not see that either. So, had that not have happened, the Russian military campaign would be at a very different stage today. So, as a result of NATO saturating Ukraine with military equipment, it is only inevitable that the Russian military campaign is moving at a very slow pace. How long will it take? Well, traditionally speaking, the Russians think in the long term. They think in terms of centuries. So if it takes them 5 years, if it takes them 10 years, if it takes them 15 years to capture either all or most of Ukraine, then that will mean that for centuries onwards, that Russia's security in the south of the country will be guaranteed. So that is the difference between between Russian policymakers and policymakers at present in the Western world. The Western policymakers, apart from other ways I can describe them, think here and now. They think in the short term, whereas the Russians think in the long term. They think in terms of centuries. As for the Russian public, they will tell you however long it takes, whatever the cost is. If it means millions of Russian military casualties, then the average Russian will say, so be it. It doesn't mean that Russians attach no value to human life. It means they have a different mindset. The average Russian will be prepared to do anything to defend Mother Russia, to defend the motherland. That is something that a great many people, ordinary people in the Western world, simply do not understand.
So I could be very much sitting on the mantelpiece in an urn before this thing finishes, and you will too. Even though you're much younger than I am and looking much better than I am, you and I will be sharing a mantelpiece maybe together before peace is actually declared. Always a pleasure talking with you, Marcus. It's you are, as I said before, you're an amazing analyst. You're a great author, historian. If somebody wants to appreciate your work and find out more about you, how do they do that?
Thank you, as always, Mike, for having me on. People can buy my books on Amazon. people can find me on various social media platforms such as Rumble, Odyssey, YouTube, and X.
Absolutely brilliant. Need to do this more often, and our audience too on the chat also enthralled with what you have to say. Marcus Papadopoulos, thank you very much, sir. This is The World Today.